All right, welcome back to the deep dive.
Mm-hmm.
Today we're tackling a subject that I think a lot of us spend a lot of time daydreaming about: early retirement.
Oh, yeah.
You, our listener, sent in a really fascinating article from AARP entitled 10 Things No One Tells You About Early Retirement.
Interesting.
And our goal today is to go beyond just like listing out those 10 points.
Yeah, right.
We want to really kind of dissect them and figure out what are some of the maybe surprising twists and turns and pull out the really valuable information for you. That can help you decide if early retirement is the right call for your future.
Absolutely. And I think AARP is a very well-respected organization. So I think they have a very grounded perspective when it comes to some of the realities of early retirement. You know, not just the dream of it, but like the nuts and bolts. And that's what we want to get into today. Really help you answer that question. Like, is early retirement the best move for you, like right now or down the line when you're thinking about it?
Okay. So let's jump right into it. And point number one is something that I think can definitely make those early retirement fantasies feel a little bit chilly.
Okay.
It's the high cost of healthcare. And, you know, as the article points out, Medicare, that doesn't kick in until you're 65.
Right.
So if you decide to retire early, well, you're on the hook to find your own health insurance.
Yeah.
And as Brian Schmehill of the Mather Group put it can cost an arm and a leg.
Oh, yeah. That's a key change for people to consider. Because for so long, you know, a good portion of your health care was handled by your employer.
Right.
And now, suddenly, you're out there on the open market trying to figure this out yourself.
You know, it's interesting because the article does point out that under current law, insurance costs are capped at 8.5% of your household income.
Yeah.
So that offers some protection.
Okay, so there are some guardrails in place, at least.
Yeah, there are some guardrails. But just to give you a sense of what that could look like, the article gives us a great example. Imagine a single person making, say, $54,360 a year.
Okay.
A mid-level silver plan could cost around $385 a month, which adds up to $4,620 a year.
Wow. That's not insignificant at all, especially when you're thinking about, you know, trying to stretch your retirement dollars as far as you can.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point for us to kind of stop and say,
Right.
Are you? Factoring in rising healthcare costs like this as you're trying to kind of make those projections about what early retirement might look like for you.
Yeah, and you know, don't forget, that's just the premium, right? You still have deductibles, copays, and the possibility of, you know, an unexpected illness or an accident.
Oh, yeah.
And so healthcare costs, they can be really unpredictable. And when you retire early, that's just a longer period of time where you're exposed to those costs without the safety net of your employer or Medicare.
Okay, well, let's move on to point number 2.
Okay.
Which is another potential cost that can really take a bite out of those early retirement savings. This is where the tax man can become a major player in your life.
Oh, yeah.
Costly early nest egg withdrawals. You know, generally, if you tap into most tax-deferred retirement accounts, things like traditional IRAs or 401ks, before you reach the age of 59 and a half, you're going to be hit with a 10% early withdrawal penalty.
Ow.
Ouch is right. And that penalty comes on top of any regular income taxes that you owe on those withdrawals.
Right. Particularly if you have one of those traditional pre-tax accounts, you know, where you haven't been paying taxes along the way. You're going to have to pay them eventually.
Right.
And you know Matt Stevens from Advice Point. He's a financial advisor. He really cautions people that navigating those early IRA withdrawals, it can be very tricky. And it's just riddled with potential penalties if you don't know the rules inside and out.
And I think the article gives a really great example of how this can actually play out. Let's say you withdraw $20,000 before you hit that magic 59 and a half mark. And you're in a 15% federal tax bracket where you could end up paying $5,000 in taxes and penalties.
Wow.
Combined, leaving you with only $15,000 of that initial withdrawal.
That's a big chunk, especially when you consider you're trying to make that money last for, you know, potentially decades.
Yeah. And, you know, I think it's a good time to kind of point out a key difference with Roth IRAs.
Oh, yeah. Great point.
You know, as you probably already know, contributions to a Roth IRA are made after taxes have already been paid.
That's right after tax contribution.
Right on that income.
Yeah.
And so that can offer a little bit more flexibility when it comes to withdrawing those contributions.
That's right, at least for those contributions.
All mostly without getting dinged by the federal government
exactly
for taxes or the 10% penalty.
Yeah.
But I think it's still really important for anyone who has a Roth IRA
Yeah, absolutely.
to understand the specific rules about withdrawing earnings
That's right.
before retirement age.
Yeah.
Because that's a whole different ballgame.
Exactly. You don't want to get hit with an unexpected penalty.
Yeah.
Or have to pay taxes that you weren't planning for.
No, absolutely not. Okay. Well, let's move on to point number 3.
Okay.
Which is all about the power of compounding interest.
Right.
Or really, I guess, the lack thereof.
The dark side of compound.
The dark side, yeah. Because we all know that time is our best friend. When it comes to saving money.
Yeah, time is on your side.
But the article really flips that on its head and says, time can actually work against you.
Interesting.
When you're spending down your savings early. Think of it like this. For years, your money has been working for you.
Right.
Just building and building.
Yeah.
But suddenly you're the one who has to do all the work to make it last. And I think the math here really illustrates this point.
Okay.
The article gives a great example. If you were to save $250 a month from age 25 to 55, and let's just assume a 6% annual return.
Okay.
Which is, historically a reasonable return.
Yeah.
You'd end up with around $237,000.
Not
bad, right? For $90,000 in contributions, that's pretty good.
Yeah, that's the power of compounding at work.
That's right. But here's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
If you decide to work just 10 more years, pushing retirement to age 65, that total jumps to almost $464,000.
Oh, wow.
So nearly double.
It's a huge difference.
Right. And what's really fascinating is that, yes, you're contributing another $30,000 over those 10 years, but the vast majority of that extra growth is from that additional decade of interest that you're earning, not just on your new contributions, but on all that previously accumulated principal and interest.
It's like a snowball rolling down a hill. Just getting bigger and bigger the longer you let it roll.
That's a great way to put it. Okay, so moving on to point number 4.
Okay.
Which is a really important consideration, the potential for a very long lifespan.
Okay.
Thanks to advances in healthcare, people are living longer
than ever before.
Right. We're all living longer than our parents and grandparents. Right. And, Angela Dorsey, who's a certified financial planner.
Okay.
She's quoted in this article as saying that, many individuals are now outliving national life expectancy averages.
Interesting.
So it's not just about planning for, what the kind of standard average is.
Right. You got to plan for the possibility of exceeding that.
Exactly. And to give you a sense of what that could look like, the article gives us some pretty eye-opening averages.
Okay.
A woman retiring at 55. She might need her savings to last for 28.6 years.
Okay.
Compared to about 20.4 years if she waits until 65. For men, it's around 25.1 years at 55 versus 17.8 years at 65.
Yeah, so that's a significant difference
Sure.
by waiting those 10 years.
Yeah, you're talking about a decade of potential expenses
that
you need to account for.
Yeah, you got to make that money last.
And I mean, it's not just about hitting those averages either.
Right.
The article throws in a pretty sobering statistic from the Society of Actuaries. If a couple reaches age 65, there's a 25% chance that the surviving spouse will live to 98.
So that's potentially a very, very long retirement.
It's a really long time to fund. So I guess the question to you is, are you really prepared for your savings to last potentially 3 decades or more?
That's a question everyone needs to be asking themselves. You can't just underestimate how long you might live.
Right.
You have to plan for a very long retirement. And that means having a substantial nest egg and managing your finances very carefully.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's move on to point number 5.
Okay.
Which really kind of challenges, I think, a very common piece of retirement advice.
Okay, what's that?
The idea that you'll only need about 80% of your pre-retirement income.
Yeah, that's a rule of thumb a lot of people throw around.
Yeah.
But is it really accurate?
Well, that's what we're going to get into here.
Yeah.
Because the article really highlights the potential for higher than expected spending.
Okay.
Especially in those early years of retirement. It's almost
Yeah.
You've finally been given permission to spend.
Right. You've been working so hard for so long.
Right.
Now it's time to enjoy yourself.
And the article even touches on this concept of a spending surge.
A spending surge, okay.
Which a JP Morgan asset management study identified. And they found that, new retirees often dive headfirst into travel.
Oh, yeah.
Home renovations, maybe even relocating.
Right.
And that can lead to much higher initial costs than they might have anticipated.
So it's like The floodgates open,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden you're spending more than you thought you would.
Right. But what's interesting is that surge does tend to level off
Oh,
after a couple of years.
so it's not necessarily a permanent thing.
Right. It's not permanent.
It's something to be aware of in those early years.
Yeah, those first couple of years are key. And, of course, we can't forget about inflation,
Oh, no, of course not. That's the silent killer.
which, has been running at 3.4% recently.
Yeah, that can really eat away at your purchasing power, especially over a long retirement.
And the article also cites this EBRI finding
Okay.
that 26% of retirees report spending more than they expected
Okay.
in key categories like housing, healthcare, medical expenses.
Interesting. So even the essential things can end up costing more than people think.
Right. And, I love this quote from Sean Pearson.
Okay.
He says, every day is Saturday.
Oh, yeah. That's a great quote.
And when you're no longer bound by a work schedule, there's a natural tendency to engage in more leisure activities.
Right.
Home projects, many of which, come at a cost.
It's easy to get caught up in that weekend mindset, and suddenly your expenses are higher than they were when you were working.
The continuous weekend lifestyle, it can add up.
It definitely can.
Okay, well, let's move on to point number 6,
Okay.
which is the often overlooked reality of unretiring housing expenses.
Unretiring housing expenses.
Yeah,
So the expenses never really retire,
they don't.
even if you do.
And I think a lot of people enter retirement with the dream of being mortgage-free.
Yeah, that's a common goal.
But, the article points out that's not always the reality. A survey by American Financing found
Yeah.
that 44%
Wow.
of retired homeowners between the ages of 60 and 70, they still have a mortgage.
So almost half of them
Yeah, almost half.
still haven't paid off their homes.
Right. And even if you do manage to pay off that mortgage
Yeah.
before you retire, it's really important to remember that, housing expenses don't just magically disappear.
Right. You still have to maintain that property.
Right. Angela Dorsey. She reminds us in the article that ongoing home maintenance and property taxes can still eat up a really big chunk of your monthly budget.
It's kind of like owning a boat. There's always something that needs fixing or upkeep.
That's a great analogy. And the article even gives us a sense of property tax rates across different states and places like New Jersey, Illinois, New Hampshire.
Yeah.
They have some of the highest property tax rates in the country.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Well, states like Hawaii, Alabama, Colorado tend to have some of the lowest.
So there's a big variation depending on where you live.
Yeah, it really does depend on location.
Yeah.
And then you've got that general rule of thumb to budget around 1% of your home's purchase price annually
Okay.
for maintenance. So if you have a $350,000 house, you're looking at about $3,500 a year.
Wow. So those costs can really add up.
They really can. But, it's worth pointing out that a lot of states offer property tax relief for homeowners
Okay.
who are 65 and older. So, you could get a little bit of a break.
Yeah, that's good to know, especially if you're on a fixed income.
Yeah. But in those early retirement years, those ongoing housing costs, they can be pretty significant. Okay, well, let's move on to point number 7,
Okay.
which is about the challenges of generating extra income
Right.
once you've retired early.
Because let's face it, sometimes things don't go according to plan. And you might need to bring in some extra cash.
Yeah, you might need to kind of supplement those savings. And a lot of people, they plan to work part-time
Yeah, I've heard that a lot.
to bring in some extra money. But the reality often looks quite different. An EBRI study found that while 70% of workers
Oh, that's a lot.
anticipate working for pay in retirement,
Okay, so most people think they're going to work at least a little bit in retirement.
only about 27%
Oh, wow.
of actual retirees.
So the reality is much different than the expectation.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
Leslie Beck, she makes a really good point
Yeah.
about the lack of flexibility
Okay.
with traditional part-time jobs. Those kinds of jobs often have very set schedules,
Right.
which can really clash
Yeah.
with other things that you might want to do in early retirement.
Yeah, like traveling or spending time with family.
Exactly. Things that require you to be available during the week.
Yeah, those traditional 9-to-5 type jobs, even if they're part-time, they can really put a crimp in your style.
Yeah, and a lot of early retirees find this lack of flexibility to be a real surprise.
Yeah, they thought they'd have all this freedom, and then they realize that they're still kind of tied down.
Right, and if you're counting on Social Security to help bridge any income gaps in early retirement,
Okay.
it's important to remember that the earliest you can claim benefits is 62.
Right.
And even then, you're only going to receive a reduced amount.
That's right. A pretty significant reduction.
Right. For anyone born in 1960 or later, the full retirement age is 67.
Okay.
And claiming at 62 results in about a 30% reduction.
Wow. That's a lot in your monthly benefit.
So, you really have to weigh that trade-off.
Absolutely.
Do you want that income sooner, but at a much lower rate for the rest of your life?
Yeah. That's a big decision. It's a really critical factor to consider in your financial planning.
Okay, well, let's move on to point number 8.
All right.
Which shifts our focus a little bit from, finances to something that's equally important, I think.
What's that time?
Time.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, the abundance of time. That early retirement brings...
It's a blessing and a curse.
It is,
Right.
because when you suddenly have that 40-hour...
Or more for a lot of people.
Or more right gap in your week, that used to be filled with work.
Mm-hmm.
What are you going to do with it?
Yeah, that's the big question.
Right, and Catherine Villegas, she poses a really great question in the article.
Yeah.
She says, are you absolutely sure that you have enough activities lined up to keep your body, your mind, and your spirit engaged and fulfilled for all those years ahead of you?
Yeah, you don't want to end up bored and restless.
Yeah.
And feeling like you're wasting your time.
Exactly. And this is where I think proactive planning
Absolutely.
is so crucial. The article really encourages you to think realistically about how you're going to fill your days beyond those initial leisurely pursuits.
Yeah, everyone dreams of traveling and golfing and relaxing. But what happens after that?
Right. What happens when you've done all the traveling you wanted to?
Or you need to have something else to keep you going.
And it suggests, exploring things like volunteering, maybe going back to school, taking up new hobbies, or rediscovering old passions. But the key takeaway here is to have that solid plan in place before you actually retire.
Yeah, that's crucial. You don't want to wait until you're already retired.
Yeah.
And then realize you have nothing to do.
Right, because then you might end up feeling adrift or unfulfilled once that initial excitement of retirement fades.
So it's really about starting something new, not just stopping something old.
That's a great way to put it. Okay, well, let's move on to point number 9.
Okay.
Which touches on something that's, a little bit less tangible, but equally important, I think.
Okay.
The potential for losing social connections.
Oh, social connections. Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah, and, if you retire in your 50s, well, a lot of your friends are still going to be working.
Right.
And they're going to have very limited availability.
Yeah.
Especially during those weekday hours that you now suddenly have free.
Yeah, it can be tough to connect with people when you're on different schedules.
Yeah. And Dennis Nolte makes a really interesting point.
Yeah.
That, if you do make new friends in retirement, those individuals, they might be significantly older than you.
Yeah.
With, different life experience, different expectations, different cultural references.
Yeah, it's a different generation.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Right.
But it is something to be mindful of as your social circles evolve.
Yeah, you might have to make an effort to connect with people who are outside of your usual age group.
Exactly.
And that can be a challenge for some people.
It can. And so, it's just a good reminder that your social landscape will likely change. And so actively nurturing those relationships and cultivating new ones can be really important for, staying connected and avoiding isolation.
Yeah, you don't want to end up feeling lonely and isolated in retirement. That can be really detrimental to your health and well-being.
Okay, well, let's move on to our final point.
Okay, the grand finale.
Point number 10.
Yeah.
Which is about the challenges that early retirement can pose for couples.
Ah, yes, the couples dynamic.
Yeah, Patty Black, she emphasizes in the article that retirement is a major life transition, and it demands a lot of patience and understanding from both partners.
Absolutely. We're both going through a huge adjustment.
And, the article really challenges, I think, this idealized image of, perpetually blissful retired couples.
Right. Just sitting on the beach, sipping margaritas.
Yeah.
But that's not always the reality.
Right. It raises some really practical questions about how chores will be divided.
The division of labor?
Yeah, because now you're both home all the time.
Right.
And the reality of spending 24/7 together, especially if you decide to downsize.
Especially in a smaller space.
Right, so it's almost like early retirement requires couples to renegotiate everything
Yeah.
from, who does the laundry
Right.
to who controls the TV remote.
Who gets to choose the vacation destination?
Exactly. And those changes
Mm-hmm.
in routines and shared space, they can create a lot of friction
Yeah, absolutely.
if they're not navigated very carefully.
And open communication is key there.
Right. And the article highlights pretty concerning trend, gray divorce.
Gray divorce.
Which is divorce after the age of 50. It has doubled
Wow.
since 1990. And oftentimes, it's initiated by wives.
Interesting.
So, that really underscores the need for open communication and really realistic expectations as you're going through this transition together.
Yeah, retirement can put a lot of strain on a relationship. You're not prepared for it.
So as we kind of bring this deep dive into the reality of early retirement, as highlighted by this AARP article, expert speaker